All right, we're in John chapter 8. We are. And, we've been moving through John, and he really moves fairly fast. We're already into probably what we would consider the last year of Jesus' ministry at this particular time. So we've really moved quick. And John does that. John really establishes the divinity of Jesus, and then he quickly moves us to like the last little bit of Jesus' life. So John spends a tremendous amount of time in the last bit. So as we move through these next few passages in John 7, John 8, we talked about it last time. There was only 7 miracles in John, right? Only 7 miracles listed. So no demons in John, no parables in John. A lot of those things just don't exist. He just didn't see the need to tell us again, I guess. So we just don't have that. But we do have these 7, and we're not to the end. We're fixing to be to 9 here in a little bit. But we've all really gone through the bulk of the miracles of John right now. And the last 2, probably the biggest, most significant miracles in John's gospel. We've moved through 7, we're in 8, and it's just a lot of discourse in here, isn't it? Jesus and the Pharisees, Jesus and talking to them, explaining to them who he was. It's a big argument, isn't it? Who are you? Who are you? Who are you? That's the big question, And Jesus doesn't really give them a straight answer, does he? But he always, especially in John, talks about the Father. I do it because of the Father. I do it to glorify the Father. I do it to represent the Father. Because he's getting to this point, he started kind of with the idea that I am the Father, right? In the beginning of John, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. But he's getting back to this point, that I am the Father, and the Father is me. And if you've seen me, you've seen God. So he's working to that, working up to that. So this is a lot of what this discourse in John is about. This idea, if you had known me, you would know my Father. This is going to come back up in John 14. This idea, if you know me, you know him, right? Now, in our lives, we often see people, and we're like, well, if you've seen this person, you kind of know this other person. They kind of represent one another. A lot of times with children or fathers and sons or mothers and daughters or whatever, you'll see that resemblance, right? And maybe this is kind of the idea that Jesus is saying here, right? Now, Paul says, and Hebrew writer says, that Jesus is the exact representation of God. In other words, he's not close, not kind of like it, not a little bit like it, but he's the exact representation of God. So we can kind of say, well, if we've seen Jesus, we've seen God. But I don't think in our minds we really think that, because we still see God as this omnipotent being that's fearful and the mountain that trembles and shakes. And we don't see Jesus that way, do we? We don't really fear Jesus like we do God. I think God kind of scares us a little bit. Oh, man, God, that's kind of scary, right? But I think Jesus doesn't really scare us like that. We kind of get more of a relationship. We think, well, we're in more of a relationship with Jesus. But, God wasn't always scary in the Old Testament, was he? He wasn't always that mountain that trembled in fire and smoke. And that wasn't always God, was it, of the Old Testament? God was compassionate in the Old Testament, wasn't he? He was compassionate towards Israel. He dealt with Abraham. He had a relationship with people in the Old Testament, right? So I don't know that our view of God, kind of got to look at the whole picture, don't you? Not just one time. Can God be scary? Absolutely, right? But is God also loving? Right? Isn't that kind of how God describes himself in Exodus? He says he's loving, right? Kind, full of compassion, right? But he's still able to wreak vengeance. Well, Jesus says, I'm God, right? If you've seen me, you've seen him. Nobody sees him. He says, you can't come where I'm going. And they were confused about that, right? You can't come there. Hold on a minute. And so the Jews are saying, surely he will not kill himself, will he? Since he says, you can't come where I'm going. He says, you're from below, I'm from above. You're of this world, I'm not of this world. You will die in your sins. Unless you believe I am he, you will die in your sins. Who are you? What have I been saying to you from the beginning? I don't know. It's pretty confusing, right? What have I been saying to you from the beginning? Well, he never did really say he was the Christ, never did really say he was the Messiah. But in John's gospel, he does say that I'm God. I'm the representation. And by that, the I am. You know, John has the I am statements, and we're going to have one of those in a minute. The I am statements that really relates him to God. Says, I am God. I am God. They did not realize he had been speaking to them about the Father. And he says, when you lift up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he. And I do nothing on my own initiative, but I speak the things the Father taught me. He who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do the things that are pleasing to him. As he spoke these things, many came to believe in him. You know, I don't know how Jesus spoke. I don't know how he talked. I don't know. But there had to be something about it. Don't you think? He had to have a certain charisma, didn't he, to him? Because people hung on his words. You know, they said, well, you teach as one having authority. You don't teach like everybody else. You teach different. There's something about it, the way he spoke, the way he talked, the way he interacted, the way he was. And he's not doing miracles here. He's not doing signs here. He's not doing great things here, but yet people are believing in him. People are saying, well, this is the Christ. This is the Christ. Why? You know, why? What was it about him that, you know, he wasn't anything to look at. We know that, right? It wasn't anything special, nothing to behold. But something about him was different, wasn't it? I don't know if it was authority. I don't know if it was how he spoke. I don't know what it was. But something about him was different. He was different in the way that he worked, in the way that he spoke, in the way that he did. It was different for him. And he says, Jews who believed him, if you continue my word, you're truly disciples of mine. You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And they said, we're Abraham's descendants, and we've never been a slave to anyone, which is totally a lie, right? Which is totally a lie, because they more or less had been. I don't know if you could say been enslaved, but they've definitely been conquered many times. We're Abraham's descendants. What do you mean we'll be free? What does it mean? And he said, everyone who commits sin is a slave. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son does remain forever. So if the son makes you free, you will be free indeed. So he says you're a slave of whatever controls you. Jesus says that over and over. You're a slave in your life of whatever controls you. If it's sin that controls you, if it's righteousness that controls you, whatever it is, you serve that. You serve whatever it is in your life that controls you. You become a slave of it. If you're addicted to something, you become a slave of that substance, don't you? You'll do anything to get it. It controls you. It manipulates you. It influences who you are, what you are. When you're young and you fall in love for the first time, and you're Twitter-pated, right? You're with love, right? You'll do anything for that person, right? They control you. You're enslaved to that relationship. And over time, I guess that fades a little bit, but Buck says it doesn't, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it has in my case, but maybe it doesn't in my case, that's for sure. But I'm still enslaved to it, but we're enslaved to those things, aren't we? To what we love, to what we desire, to what we want in our lives. Whatever that may be. If you want a house bad enough or you want a car bad enough, it will enslave you, won't it? You'll do anything to make that payment, to get it, to buy it, to own it, to possess it. Things enslave us, and that's what Jesus is saying. But he says sin can enslave us, right? And it can. We become controlled by that. So Jesus says, I can free you from that. And you can be free indeed if you believe in me. And he says, I know that you're Abraham's descendants, yet you seek to kill me. My word has no place in you. I speak the things I've seen with my Father. Therefore, you also do the things you heard from your father. Interesting, capitalized in 38, not capitalized at the bottom, right? My Father, God, your Father, earthly Father. And the answer that said, Abraham is our father. And Jesus says, if you're Abraham's descendants, do the deeds of Abraham. But as it is, you're seeking to kill me, a man who has told you the truth. I heard from God. This Abraham did not do. You are doing the deeds of your father. And they said to him, we're not born of fornication. We have one Father, God. So it's interesting, this discourse, you know. We're Abraham's children. That's what they said, right? They said, we're Abraham's children. But then at the bottom, he says, we're not sons of fornication. We have one Father, God. But they just said they were Abraham's children. We're children of Abraham. And Jesus said, well, if you're children of Abraham, do the deeds of Abraham, right? Be righteous. Do what Abraham did. But you won't even do that. So then they kind of turned around. They said, well, God's our Father. And they said, well, we're not born of fornication, right? In other words, God's our Father. So this great discourse that Jesus is having with these Jews, they don't really understand what he's trying to say. It's confusing. It's kind of confusing to us. But he's trying to make them understand, and apparently a lot of them do. Apparently a lot of them believe here. But he's trying to make them understand that I'm God, and God is me. And if you've seen me, you've seen God. And I shouldn't have to explain to you who I am, because by seeing me, by seeing what I do, by seeing the things I've done, you should come to that conclusion on your own. But you don't want to do that, because you are in sin, because you're enslaved to your lifestyle, to what you want, not to what God desires of you. It's an age-old thing that we're going through here, an age-old thing. If God were your Father, you would love me, because I'm God. It's basically what he's saying. He sent me. Why do you not understand what I am saying? It is because you cannot hear my word. Why don't you understand that I'm God? Why don't you understand that I'm the Son? Well, because they don't want to, right? That's the answer to the question. They don't want to understand it. They like it how it is. This isn't what they wanted. This isn't what they expected. Jesus says, can't you see me? Can't you see who I am? Don't you understand it? Can you not hear me? But he says, you're of your father, the devil. You want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer. He does not stand in the truth. He just said, you want to kill me. He just said, I'm the truth. The truth will set you free. Now he says, you're of Satan. He was a murderer, right? A murderer from the beginning, a liar from the beginning. He doesn't stand in the truth. There's no truth in him. He speaks from his own nature. He's a liar and the father of lies. Because I speak the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I speak truth, why do you not believe me? Well, there's a lot of reasons we don't believe truth. Because sometimes we think truth is kind of relative, don't we? There's my truth. But my truth isn't necessarily true, right? Truth is sometimes hard to hear, hard to accept, especially if it challenges what we believe, challenges what we think. Truth is hard. So we struggle with it. We struggle with truth. What is real truth? Pilate's going to ask that question, right? What is the truth, right? What is the truth? Well, what is the truth, right? Something that can't be proven wrong, a fact. Jesus says, I'm the truth. I'm the truth of God. This is truthfully what God is. And you're not. Because you're desiring something that God doesn't desire. And you're not understanding who I am. It says, the Jews answered, we do not say rightly. Do we not say right that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? So, that's their answer, right? He says you're of Satan. They say, no, you're of Satan. We're pointing fingers at each other, right? You have a demon. You're wrong. You're a Samaritan. Going to play it down. Well, they know he's not a Samaritan. Jesus doesn't answer the Samaritan thing at all. Doesn't even broach that subject. But he says to him, he says, I do not have a demon. I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. I do not seek my glory. There is one who seeks and judges. If anyone keeps you my word, he will never see death. That's a huge statement, right? He will never see death. Well, if you and I heard that, we would think, I would never die here. I mean, that's kind of what I would think. I would never die here. Of course, that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about the idea of death here. He's talking about the idea of eternal death. He says, we know that you have a demon, because they took it like we would take it. You'll never die. Abraham died. The prophets died. Everybody died, right? You're not greater than Abraham, are you? The prophets? Who do you make yourself out to be? Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me. And I think when he talks about glorifying here, he's really talking about being resurrected. Jesus is going to glorify me beyond this earth, and you're going to see that. But you're still not going to believe. You're still not going to believe. You have come to know him. I know him. I'll be a liar like you, but I do know him and keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Boy, that's blasphemy, isn't it? Abraham rejoiced to see my day. And they're saying, how do you know Abraham, right? How can you know that? You're not 50 years old, and you've seen Abraham? And then 58. That's another I am statement in John. Those are so bad to the Jews. Because in Exodus, when Jesus was called Moses from the burning bush, he said, who do you say sent me? And he says, the I am. So when Jesus says I am, what do they think? They think God. Right? And John's full of these I am statements, what Jesus says. And it's one of those statements when Jesus says it, the air just sucks out of the room. It's like, you can't say that. Right? You can't say that. But Jesus said, he says, before Abraham was born, I am, and they wanted to kill him. Right? Because right there, he basically said, I'm God. I'm God. That's big, isn't it? I mean, that's a huge statement to say. I am. I am. Well, to a Jew, that means I am. I am the I am, right? Before Abraham was born, before Abraham was, right? I am. That's a huge statement. So now he's saying, I am God. Now they get it. They have to get it. But they don't believe it, and they don't believe that he is, and they don't want to accept it, so they're going to stone him to death, right? Because that's what we do. But we move on. It's a shift. So we have this huge discourse with the Pharisees. I know I kind of rushed through it because I didn't want to bog you down in it. It's a lot, but it's a lot of the same in a lot of ways. It's just this huge argument that he has. They don't believe him. They don't want to know who he is, but they won't accept who he is. He more or less is saying right here, I am God. You can see that in the discourse. He said so many things. This is I am God. If you've seen me, you've seen God, right? The I am statement. All these things that say I am God, and yet they don't want to. They want to kill him, but once again he slips away, and that leads us into the sixth miracle of John, right? Which I think is one of the greatest ones. The man blind from birth, John chapter 9. John chapter 9. So I kind of rushed through that a little, kind of intended to. I didn't want to get really bogged down in the middle of all that. Are there any comments? Are we good? The miracle of the man born blind in John 9 is probably one of the greatest miracles of the Bible in a lot of ways. But John used it because it really talks about the deity of Jesus. It's a man blind from birth. And it seems to me in this story that Jesus would have passed by. I don't really know that Jesus would have stopped to heal this man unless something had been brought to his attention. There were a lot of people Jesus didn't heal, right? Jesus didn't heal everybody, obviously. A lot of people he didn't heal. But this is interesting in many ways. Because for one thing, after all this discussion we just had about him being God, right? We had this huge discourse, huge discussion about I'm God and I'm the Father and the Father's me and I'm the I am. And when we get to 9, the disciples, interestingly here it says disciples, say Rabbi. So after all this discussion we just had about who he is, they're still calling him a rabbi, still calling him a teacher, right? Teacher, right? Which I think is kind of interesting. And so they did this, and he said, and it was a question, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind? In their life and their society, physical ailment was a direct result of sin. It wasn't genetics. It wasn't a parasite or a bug or a virus or a bacteria. It wasn't any of those things. It wasn't environment or what you did to yourself or how you ate or what you drank or what you smoked. It was real simple. Cause and effect, right? Their cause and effect was super simple, right? Everything comes from God. So if you have misfortune, what did you do? Isn't that kind of the scope of religion at that point in history? And in a lot of ways, maybe still kind of the scope of religion at that point in history, even if you get out of Christianity, go into other religions of the world. When bad things happen, what did they do? They sacrificed to gods, didn't they? I mean, whether you're talking about Greeks or Romans or whatever. If bad things happened, you went to that god and you made a sacrifice because obviously you made him mad, made her mad, whatever. Whatever god it was, obviously you offended it. And because of that, you had to make amends. You had to, right? You had to make a sacrifice. You had to do something because it was real simple. If it didn't rain on your crops, then you needed to go talk to the god of rain, you know. If you didn't get any sun, you need to go talk to the god of sun, right? If you didn't get pregnant, you need to go talk to the goddess of fertility, right? If he was a Greek, that was Artemis, right? Go talk to the goddess of fertility, make a sacrifice because your womb was barren. And that was the reason, right? Cause and effect. You and I don't live in that world. It's not the same to us. But to them, it was real cut and dried. If you were sick, you did something. If you were blessed, you did something, right? Real simple, easy. But, of course, we know it's not true, but that was their world. And Jesus never argued it. That's the fascinating thing about it. Jesus never really argued that point. He would say to them, right, when we talked about the man that was lame, and he said, what would be easier for me to say to you? Take up your bed and walk, or your sins be forgiven. Remember that? He says either way, you think it's the same thing, right? If you're healed, you think I forgive his sins because you think sin's what caused him to be sick. If I say I forgive your sins, and his sins are gone, and he's well because his sins made him sick. So either way I put it, it's irrelevant because you think it's the same thing. Jesus never argued it with them. But in this case, in John 9, it's really interesting. He says it wasn't anybody, but he was born that way so the works of God might be displayed in him. If you ever want to wrestle with a verse, that's a good one. That's a good one. I mean, I don't think that was a lot of comfort to the guy that was blind. Do you? You know, I've been this way my whole life just so this could happen. I would just as soon have seen. All right? I walked into a million walls so that this could happen. I don't think it was really comforting to this situation. And I don't know why Jesus put it that way necessarily, but he did. And he said, we must work the works he has sent me as long as it is day, night is coming. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And he brings us up to a guy that's blind, a guy that doesn't have light, a guy that doesn't see. And John's kind of the gospel of light. He's always talking about that. Even in the beginning of it, he says, it's your eyes, right, and how you perceive. And I'm the light of the world, and there's darkness in the world. And John pits it against one another. Even as Jesus spoke about Satan, he really put the conflict between him and Satan. Satan's all lies. Satan's all bad. Satan's all dark. God's all good. This good and evil situation that we really see in John. And here he really brings this idea up that I'm the light of the world, right? In other words, I'm the one that's going to make you see. I'm the one that's going to give you sight. This man was blind. We don't know why he was blind. He was born that way. I mean, it's genetic. I don't know. Something was wrong. Who sinned? If we look at Exodus where Jesus says he's able to carry sin to the third and fourth generations, right? So they're saying, well, I don't know how they could say this man sinned because this man was born blind. That's always kind of confused me, right? Did this man sin? Well, how could he sin? He was born blind, right? But the idea of the parents sinning, that was real in Judaism. And God alludes to that in Exodus, and I think that's a passage we'd have to look at a little harder, but God alludes to that idea. I'm able to carry out my punishment on the third and fourth generation. Now, I don't think God's necessarily talking about infirmity necessarily there, But he's talking about the idea that I can carry that forward. So they really thought that. If I sinned, then my kids could pay for that. My kids could have, maybe because of what I did, my kids could pay for that. So they really believed that, and they really hung a lot on that. Now, the Old Testament also says that's not really true. Isaiah says, right, whoever eats the grapes, their teeth shall be set on edge. Basically, he's saying, it's your own deal, you know. If you eat it, you're the one that's going to pay for it. He who sins is going to pay for it. So Isaiah really turns that around. But their idea was still pretty set in how they thought about it. And so it's interesting. This is an interesting miracle for a couple of reasons. One is Jesus didn't always physically touch anybody when he performed a miracle. And the other thing is he didn't always spit and make mud, but he did a few times. I think it's an interesting story because, for one thing, is this guy was submitting to what Jesus did, and he really doesn't know who Jesus is at this particular junction. I think that's a little interesting. I don't know that I would let somebody spit and put their spit in my eyes if I didn't know who they were. I think that might be a little too personal to me to have that done, right? But here, as he gets into this, it says, he said, he spat on the ground, he made clay of spittle. We don't know what happened here, this discourse. Apparently the blind man was listening to it, you know, which would have been kind of interesting. You were born blind. You were born this way so that God could be glorified. But he submitted to what Jesus did. Jesus made the clay. He put it on his eyes. But the interesting thing here is that if you really look at this text, is that he never really saw the guy who did this. He was blind the whole time, right? He said, go wash in the pool of Siloam, right? So he went away and washed, and he came back seeing. So he never saw Jesus, did he? Never saw him. Didn't know what he looked like. Didn't know any of that. Didn't have a clue. He just knew this guy come along, put spit mud in his eyes, and told him to go wash, which apparently he was obedient to go do, and then he got his sight. I think it's really interesting how this all played out. I've often wondered how long this took. How far was the pool from where he healed him? I don't know. How did he find the pool? He was blind. I don't know. I guess somebody let him. These questions are always in my head. How did this work, right? How did it play out? Well, I don't have all the answers, but I know that his vision was restored. And they knew it, and they questioned it because he looked different now. He could see. It always amazes me in the Bible, on these sight miracles especially, they never really say the reaction of the person who could see again so much, right? I've always wanted to know that. You know, what was it like to see if you could never see in your life? What was it like when he washed in that pool and all of a sudden he could see the world? What was that like? I can't even imagine what that was like. And the Bible doesn't tell us. The text doesn't tell us, right? The text just says that people knew it was him, and they knew he was blind, and they knew he could see, and they knew there was a miracle that was performed. And they were saying, it can't be him, right? Because it's not believable. This is unbelievable. This is an unbelievable miracle, right? It's like if you see somebody that your whole life's been one way, and then all of a sudden you see him another way, and you're like, that can't be him. That can't be that guy, right? That can't be that lady. That can't be that person. And then you realize, well, maybe it is. Maybe it is. No, that's not him. Surely that can't be him. It just looks like him. That's his twin. That's his doppelganger, right? Isn't that what we call that? That's his doppelganger, right? It's his twin. And that can't be him because this guy didn't see. This guy didn't look like this. Can you imagine he was different, wasn't he? Just the way he stood up. And, you know, if you're blind and you're always stumbling and you're probably down, and can you imagine now his face was probably up and he was looking out and he could see and he was standing upright and he was different. And they said, oh, that can't be him. That can't be him. But it is him. But it is him, isn't it? Isn't this the guy? Isn't this the guy? How are your eyes open? How can you do that? And he says, this man who is called Jesus made clay. And I love how he puts it. It's almost like this guy doesn't really even know who Jesus is whatsoever, right? It's almost like he was under the rock, like he doesn't know who this guy is. This man who's called Jesus. That's really generic, isn't it? That's really a generic way to put it. It's like I really don't know. This guy called Jesus. Haven't heard of him, right? He did this. He anointed my eyes. He says, go and wash. So I went away and washed, and I received my sight. Where is he? He says, I don't know. I don't know where he is. I don't know what he looks like. I never saw him. I couldn't pick him out of a lineup. I don't know who he is. So they brought it to the Pharisees. Now listen to when it was. Surprise, surprise, right? It was on the Sabbath, right? You know, we saw that with the man, and see John, he's picking these miracles specifically to tell us something. This guy is not only Jesus, he not only does these miracles, but he's God. He does this on the Sabbath. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. And they were asking how he see decide. He said to them, he applied clay, and I washed and see. This man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. It's not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. He just give this guy his sight. And yet all they can think of is, once again, what day did you do it on, right? When Jesus purposefully did it on that day, didn't he? He could have waited. This guy was blind from birth. One more day, it's not going to kill the deal. You know what I'm saying? He could have said, let's do this on Sunday, right? But he did it on the Sabbath, specifically on the Sabbath for a reason. And so the Pharisees once again say, well, this guy can't be of God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath. This argument that we've had over and over and over. And he says, others were saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And there was division among them, right? Because how can he do this? How can he do this kind of a miracle? How can he make somebody see if he's not from God? How can he do that? How can a sinner perform such signs? It's interesting how they say it, isn't it? Sin's so big here. If he's a sinner, he can't do it. He'd have to be a righteous man to do it. How can a sinner perform such miracles? How can he do that? What do you say about him since he opened your eyes? And he said, he is a prophet. Well, he doesn't know who he is. So he's got to kind of make a conclusion, right? And so his conclusion is, well, he's a prophet. He's a prophet. And the Jews didn't believe it of him. You're not the guy. That's the first explanation. You're just simply not the guy. It was somebody else. Looks just like you, but it wasn't you. Couldn't be. We would think the same thing. It's impossible. This is impossible, right? You and I would think the same thing. This can't be because it's impossible. Can't be, right? So we got to have proof. So let's go get his parents. The parents in this story are the greatest part of the whole story. They had to be the worst parents ever, okay? These are the worst parents ever. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. If you had parents like this, you probably want to be blind. I mean, these guys, they're terrible. They're awful, you know? They were afraid, but I just can't believe it. You know, if something like that happened to one of my kids, I really wouldn't care what anybody thought. I mean, that would just be, wouldn't you? I mean, that would be amazing, right? Yeah. Right, but it gets better. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. They deflect, don't they? His parents said, we know it's our son. We know he was born blind. But how he now sees, we don't know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself. So they're kind of afraid here. You're going to see this in the text. it's kind of what's more important to us. Well, this kind of gives you an idea how strong the pull of Judaism was and the temple and all those things that went with it, because they really deflect themselves away from him. His parents said this because they were afraid. The Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, he is of age, ask him. They were afraid, weren't they? Afraid of being put out of the synagogue. It was big in Judaism, right? It was everything. That was their life, their livelihood. Maybe their livelihood, their profession maybe depended upon it. It was a big thing. But it just amazes me. Yeah, go ahead, Corky. Well, no, because if they confessed that he was Christ, if he was the Christ, then they would put him out, basically. So if his parents said, Jesus did this, or God did this, or this was a miracle, then they would have put him out of the synagogue, because they would have been saying that Jesus had the power to do that, and they weren't going to say that. So they just deflected it away and said, well, you need to ask him, you need to ask him. But I've always just thought, man, if that had been my kid, I don't think fear would have held me back from praising God for what he did. I just don't think it would have. That's just too big of a thing, isn't it? That's just too big of a thing. But they were scared, afraid, and they didn't do it. I don't know what his relationship was with his parents. I've often wondered. But if you kind of put it together a little here, he was on the street begging, right? Isn't that where he was? I mean, that's kind of the way. Can't we kind of read that into the story? When Jesus saw him and passed by him, he was probably begging. He was on the street. So his parents probably weren't taking care of him anyway. You can't say that for sure, but in that society, in that world, to be sick was to be unclean. It was to be despised by God. It was to be shameful. And people distanced themselves from the sick, distanced themselves from those who weren't clean. We see that throughout the Bible. Jesus accused the Jews of that over and over and over, right? You even see it with a man that was lame. They passed by him every day, but they wouldn't do anything. Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, where the man was injured on the side of the road, and they passed by him because they didn't want to be unclean. They distanced themselves from the unclean. So even though it was their son, I would say, not I can prove it, but I would say they didn't have a good relationship. I would say they probably had put him out. So this is a big thing. But now think about this with me. I know we're about out of time, and I know I probably read way too much into this, but think about this with me for a minute. So your son's unclean. You're a Jew, right? Your son's blind. He's unclean. More or less, you put him out of your household. He can't go to synagogue. He can't go to the temple. He can't do those things because he's not clean. When Jesus gives this man back his sight, it's more than just that he can see. It's that he can be part of your family again. He can go to synagogue with you. He can go to temple with you. He can do all those things that he never could do before because he wasn't clean. He was damaged in that society. He was damaged, right? It isn't like our world. He was damaged goods. He was out of the house, out of the family, out of the synagogue, out of the temple, out of everything, despised by God. Am I right? But once he got his vision back, all of a sudden he could be part of the family again. He could go to synagogue. He could go to temple. He could participate. He was now clean. How big would that be? And that's how come I say these are the worst parents ever, because it'd be like your child was gone from you, and now you got him back. And I don't think anything would have kept my joy at that point. Yeah, go ahead. I can't answer. I don't know the question. I don't know the answer to the question. But I know in that society, when you were damaged, I don't know how else to say that, however you would be, whatever you would call that, you were unclean, and you were essentially ostracized from that society because In their mind, it was your sin or your parents' sin. And that probably fell back on them too, you know. So, so it was, yeah, right. So it's so big. It's a bigger miracle than just the fact that he can see. And that's what, that's what I want you to see. Ah, that's a pun. Go ahead.
I'm not everything, every step you take is written by God guy, by no means. But this, Jesus said, he's here for a purpose. So whatever that relationship was, that was a meant to be moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Undoubtedly.
Yeah, it was meant to happen for sure.
And I'm not everything is meant to be guy by no
Hmm.
means, but this was a separate deal. I think
Hmm.
this was a meant to be.
Yeah. So it was, I don't know, I guess we're way out of time, but I just want you to see this was really bigger miracle than just the sight. It was like making him clean again in Judaism. That's big. That's a huge thing. Thanks for your time this morning.